Disclaimer: this program contains graphic descriptions of real crimes. Viewer discretion is advised. All parties are presumed innocent until proven guilty in court. A father's love is supposed to be unconditional. Robert Stanton had always lived by that creed. He gave his son Michael life once when he was born, and decades later he gave him life again when doctors said Michael's kidneys were failing. Without hesitation, Robert offered his own. "Take mine," he told the surgeon. "He's my boy." On the day of surgery, Robert's body shook with nerves, but his heart was steady. He told himself the pain didn't matter, that scars on his own body were nothing compared to seeing his son get a second chance. As he drifted into anesthesia, his last thought was of Michael smiling again, living again. The surgery was a success. When Robert awoke, sore and groggy, he squeezed Michael's hand and whispered, "We did it, son. You're going to be okay." For a fleeting moment, Robert felt something he hadn't felt in years: closeness. Michael, the boy who had grown distant, who had chased quick money schemes and left a trail of unpaid debts, was back in his life. The transplant, Robert thought, might be the bridge to rebuild what had been broken, but even in those first days subtle shadows crept in. Michael's gratitude felt strangely hollow. His smile never quite reached his eyes. Nurses later recalled that while Robert spoke endlessly about how proud he was to help, Michael seemed restless, checking his phone, pacing the halls, already distracted by something else. Robert ignored it. Fathers always do. He told himself Michael was just overwhelmed, adjusting to the idea of being alive again. He wanted to believe this was their turning point. Yet within 30 days, Robert would discover a chilling truth. The son whose life he had saved had already placed a price tag on his own father's head, $500,000, and with every passing day, Robert would come to realize the gift he had given wasn't a bridge to closeness. It was a curse that tied him to his son in the darkest way imaginable. For Robert, recovery was slow. Each morning, he pressed his palm against the scar running down his side, reminder of what he had given up. It ached when he bent over. It pulled when he tried to lift anything. But each time he told himself it was worth it. His son had a future. His sacrifice meant Michael would live. But Michael wasn't thinking about second chances. He was thinking about money. Behind closed doors, Michael's life was collapsing. He owed tens of thousands to loan sharks and gamblers. Men were calling his phone at all hours, threatening him, demanding payment. And now that he had his health back, he wanted more. Something faster than rebuilding his life. Something easy. That's when the idea took hold. Just 1 month after the surgery, Michael sat in a downtown insurance office. He smoothed out the application form with steady hands, even as his mind raced. The number he wrote, $500,000, felt unreal, a fortune, enough to erase his debts, enough to live free. The agent looked up. "You're insuring your father." Michael smiled, cool and convincing. "It's just precaution. He's older, you know. I want to protect the family if something ever happens." But in truth, he wasn't protecting anything. He was laying a trap, a $500,000 death sentence with his father's name scrawled across it. When the policy was approved, Michael slipped the confirmation letter into his bag and walked out into the cool spring air. For him, it wasn't paperwork, it was possibility, a payday waiting for the right moment. At home, Robert noticed the change. Michael hovered, asking questions that sent shivers down his spine. "You've been tired lately, right?" "Dad, you should really be careful about those meds. Overdosing could be dangerous. You ever think about what would happen if you weren't around?" At first, Robert brushed it off as concern, but the unease grew. The words felt rehearsed, calculated, as if Michael wasn't worried about his health, but waiting for it to fail. The final straw came late one evening. Michael had left a pile of unopened mail on the kitchen counter. Robert, curious, began flipping through the envelopes. That's when he saw it, his own name printed in bold letters at the top of a letterhead from an insurance company. His stomach dropped as he read the words. A policy, $500,000, and the beneficiary, Michael. The room spun, his chest tightened, he sank into a chair, clutching the paper with shaking hands. His son, the boy he had raised, the boy he had just saved, had put a price on his death. And in that moment, Robert felt something colder than betrayal. He felt hunted. Robert sat at the kitchen table with the insurance letter trembling in his hands. The scar on his side burned as though reminding him of the life he had given away, a piece of himself that his son now seemed ready to cash in on. That night he confronted Michael. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. Robert held up the letter and asked, his voice raw and uneven, "What is this, Michael? Why would you take out $500,000 on my life?" Michael didn't flinch. He leaned back in his chair, lips curling into something between a smirk and a sneer. "It's called financial planning, Dad. You're not going to live forever. At least this way, if something happens, the family's covered." But the way he said, "if something happens," sent a chill crawling up Robert's spine. There was no warmth in his words, no reassurance, just calculation. For the first time, Robert saw his son not as the boy he had raised, but as a man with cold eyes and a plan. The days that followed were worse. The house was filled with silence, but it wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, suffocating. Michael's footsteps seemed to echo. His presence felt predatory. And Robert began to notice things. The brakes on his truck failed one morning as he pulled out of the driveway. Mechanics later said the lines looked tampered with. He fell violently ill after a dinner Michael insisted on cooking. Tests revealed toxins in his system. At night, he'd hear Michael pacing outside his door, lingering, as if waiting for something. Robert stopped sleeping. He locked his bedroom at night, kept a baseball bat by the bed, and confided in his sister, Karen. "If something happens to me," he whispered over the phone, "don't believe it was an accident. Promise me you'll ask questions." The uneasy silence between father and son had curdled into something deadlier. Every glance felt like a threat. Every meal tasted like poison, and deep down Robert knew the son he had saved was waiting for the chance to bury him. Robert's hands wouldn't stop shaking. Every creak of the house, every glance from Michael felt like a countdown. He couldn't live like this, sleeping behind a locked door, checking his food second, guessing whether the man across the table was still his son or already his executioner. One morning, after another sleepless night, Robert drove to the police station. He carried the insurance letter folded in his jacket pocket like contraband. The desk sergeant looked at him curiously as he stammered out the words, My son took out a $500,000 policy on me, and now I think he's trying to kill me." At first, the officers exchanged looks of doubt. Parents came in all the time with fears about their children, arguments, threats, domestic disputes, but this was different. The weight in Robert's voice, the tremor in his hands, the scar peeking from under his shirt, it all spoke of a man desperate to survive. Detectives opened an initial file. They interviewed him in a small gray room, recording every detail, the cut-break lines, the sudden illness after Michael's cooking, the constant questions about his health. Then Robert slid the letter across the table. The room went silent. That was the turning point. The detectives knew what they were staring at wasn't paranoia. It was motive. And when they ran Michael's financials, the picture darkened further. Tens of thousands in gambling debts, payments missed, threats from known loan sharks. The investigation widened, quiet surveillance began. Officers followed Michael's movements, tracked his calls, and waited to see if Robert's nightmare would prove true. It didn't take long. Within weeks, detectives captured Michael on a wiretap meeting with a gambling enforcer. His words were as cold as the insurance form he had signed. "He's stubborn. It's taking too long. I need this handled." For the police, it was confirmation. For Robert, it was devastation. The boy he had given life to, Weiss, had been planning his death all along. And now, with the evidence mounting, the silent war inside the Stanton household was about to explode into the open. The walls of the Stanton home had grown quiet, too quiet. Robert barely spoke at the dinner table anymore. His appetite was gone, his trust shattered. Each bite of food, each sip of water, carried the weight of suspicion. And Michael. He carried on with a cool detachment, humming as he moved around the kitchen, tapping away on his phone late at night, as if the unease in the house was nothing more than background noise. But outside those walls, detectives were watching. Unmarked cars lingered at the end of the street. Tiny cameras tracked Michael's comings and goings, and when his phone lit up, investigators traced every number, every whisper of conversation. What they uncovered painted a chilling portrait. One recording captured Michael speaking in low, clipped tones to a man already known for violent collections. The words hung like poison in the air. "The payout's waiting, 500 grand, he just needs to go, and it has to look clean." Another time, investigators followed him to a hardware store. He purchased heavy-duty rope, a jug of industrial cleaner, and a lockbox. Individually, the items meant little, but together, under the shadow of the insurance policy, they read like a checklist for a crime not yet committed. Meanwhile, Robert's fears sharpened. He noticed Michael watching him too closely, hovering near the garage when he left for work, lingering outside his locked bedroom door at night. It was a predator's patience, waiting for the perfect opening. The breaking point came one night when Robert returned home to find his house alarm disabled. The keypad's wires had been tampered with. He froze in the doorway, his chest pounding. For the first time, he realized he was no longer living in his home. He was trapped in someone else's hunting ground. He called the detectives in a whisper, his voice shaking. "It's him. I know it's him. He's waiting for the right night." Within hours, police secured the house, bugged more rooms, and instructed Robert to go about life as normal. Their trap was set. Days later it sprung. Michael's conversations grew bolder, less cautious. He asked an associate for something that could make it look like a heart attack. He joked about how old men don't last long anyway. When the recordings were played back for Robert, he broke down. The truth wasn't whispered in shadows anymore. It was undeniable, carved into tape. His son wasn't just considering betrayal. He was planning it, and now the only question was whether Robert would survive long enough for justice to arrive. The trap had been set. Weeks of surveillance, hours of recordings, a mountain of evidence. Every thread pointed to one chilling truth. Michael Stanton was actively plotting his father's death. Detectives decided it was time to move in. On a gray afternoon, Robert sat in his kitchen, his scar aching, his nerves raw. He had been briefed. The police would make their move today. But even knowing that, every tick of the clock felt like another chance for Michael to strike. The sound came suddenly, a knock at the front door. Michael stepped into the house, casual, as though nothing were wrong. But in his backpack, police would later find a vial of poison, small enough to slip unnoticed into a drink. That was the moment the detectives had been waiting for. They swarmed in, plainclothes officers bursting through the doorway, badges flashing. Michael Stanton, police, hands where we can see them. Robert watched, frozen, as his son's face twisted from shock to fury. Michael shouted, demanded to know what was happening. tried to protest that it was all a mistake. But when detectives emptied his bag onto the table, the truth clattered out with it. Poison, ropes, and a neatly folded copy of the $500,000 insurance policy. The room turned to ice. Robert felt his chest cave in. This wasn't suspicion anymore. This wasn't paranoia. It was proof, tangible, undeniable, that his only child had been preparing to kill him. Detectives cuffed Michael as he barked excuses, wild and desperate. It was just a plan B. I wasn't really gonna do it. He's overreacting. But the evidence spoke louder than his words. For Robert, the sound of the handcuffs snapping shut was both relief and heartbreak. He had survived, but as he stared at the boy he once cradled in his arms, the boy he had given life to twice, he realized he had also lost him forever. The father's sacrifice had been transformed into a son's betrayal. And with Michael led out the door in chains, Robert was left standing in the silence of his home, alive, but carrying a wound deeper than any surgeon's knife could cut. The arrest of Michael Stanton hit the news within hours. Local stations ran the story on repeat, anchors struggling to frame it in words. A father gives his son a kidney. 1 month later, the son is arrested for plotting his father's murder, hoping to collect $500,000 in life insurance. The headlines spread like wildfire. Newspapers called it the ultimate betrayal. Talk shows debated it with horrified fascination. How could a son turn so cold against the man who had given him life, not once, but twice? By the time the case went to trial, the courtroom was packed. Families, reporters, even strangers stood shoulder to shoulder in the gallery. They wanted to see for themselves the face of a man who had nearly killed his own father for money. Prosecutors built their case methodically, laying out each piece of evidence like a brick in a wall. The $500,000 insurance policy, taken out just weeks after the transplant. The gambling debts, documented through bank records and creditor testimony. The tampered brakes and the poison traces found in Robert's system. The wiretap recordings where Michael's own voice coldly described how his father was taking too long to go. When those recordings echoed through the courtroom speakers, even the jurors stiffened. Robert sat in the witness stand, eyes downcast, listening to his son's voice casually weigh his life against money. Then it was Robert's turn to speak. His words cut deeper than any evidence could. I gave him everything I had. I gave him my health. I gave him my trust. I gave him my kidney so he could live, and he wanted to repay me by watching me die. The room fell silent. Some jurors wiped their eyes. Reporters scribbled furiously. Even the judge paused, his gavel resting midair. Michael's defense team tried to spin the story, claiming he was never serious, that it was just desperate talk under pressure. But the weight of the evidence and the gravity of his father's testimony left little room for doubt. The betrayal wasn't just financial, it wasn't just criminal, it was human, and it was absolute. And as the trial stretched on, the nation realized they weren't just witnessing a crime. They were witnessing one of the darkest parables of family, greed, and trust ever brought to light. The jury deliberated for less than 2 days, but for Robert, each hour felt like another slow knife twisting in his chest. He sat in the courthouse hallway, staring at the scar along his side, the reminder of the organ he had given to the very man now facing justice. When the courtroom doors opened and the jury filed back in, the air was suffocating. Reporters clutched their pens, families held their breath. Robert kept his hands clenched tight, bracing for the words that would decide his son's fate. The foreman rose, voice steady. We find the defendant, Michael Stanton, guilty of attempted murder, guilty of insurance fraud, guilty of conspiracy to commit homicide. The words landed like thunder. Gasps filled the room. Robert closed his eyes, a mix of relief and grief flooding his body. His son, the boy he once carried on his shoulders, the boy whose life he had saved, was now branded a criminal for trying to take his father's life. Sentencing came weeks later, but the weight of it was crushing. The judge, stern and unflinching, spoke of calculated greed, and a betrayal so profound it strikes at the core of human decency. He sentenced Michael Stanton to 25 years in prison without parole eligibility for the first 15. Michael showed no tears, no remorse. His jaw tightened, his eyes cold. He looked at his father once, briefly, but there was no flicker of regret, only anger at being caught. Robert wept quietly in the gallery, his sister's arm around his shoulder. It wasn't the sentence that broke him. It was the sight of his son being led away in chains, a future sealed behind bars. He had survived. The system had protected him, but the unbearable truth was this: survival had cost him his son. The boy he saved was gone. What remained was a hollow shell, consumed by greed and betrayal. For Robert, freedom meant living with the echo of his son's voice on those tapes, the image of his son smirking across the table, the knowledge that love had been answered with malice. He had given life twice, and in return he would spend the rest of his days carrying the heaviest truth a parent could bear. Sometimes the child you save is the one who tries hardest to destroy you. When the sentence was handed down and the courtroom emptied, the world's fascination didn't fade. It only deepened. News outlets called it the betrayal that shocked America. Documentaries dissected every detail, from the transplant to the trial. On talk shows, experts debated, was Michael driven purely by desperation, or was there something darker inside him all along? For Robert, none of the noise mattered. He returned to a quiet house, scarred both inside and out. The scar along his ribs ached when he bent over to tie his shoes, but the scar in his heart ached every second of the day. He had survived, yes, but survival felt like a hollow prize when the cost was losing his only son. Neighbors avoided the subject, offering polite nods and forced smiles. Friends visited less often, unsure what to say to a man who had lived through such unthinkable betrayal. At night, Robert often sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the empty chair where Michael used to sit, the silence pressing in on him like a weight. Yet his story echoed far beyond his small Ohio town. Universities used the case in criminology lectures, framing it as a chilling study in family betrayal and financial motive. Counselors referenced it in workshops about elder protection, warning parents to always safeguard their assets, even from those closest to them. On social media, debates raged. Some commenters insisted Michael's debts and desperation pushed him into a corner. Others rejected that excuse outright, calling the act a moral abyss that no hardship could justify. But one truth rose above the noise. This story wasn't just about money or crime. It was about love twisted into leverage, about a bond so sacred it should have been unbreakable, and how greed shattered it into something monstrous. For Robert, the lesson was painfully clear. Trust, once broken, is never whole again, and sometimes the greatest danger doesn't come from strangers lurking in the dark, but from the very people we would give our lives to save. The case of Robert and Michael Stanton became a haunting reminder across the country. Even love, the deepest, purest kind, can be corrupted when money enters the equation, and for Robert, each new day was both a gift and a burden. He had given his son life twice, but now he lived with the knowledge that the second gift nearly cost him his own. In the end, the case of Robert and Michael Stanton was never just about crime, money, or even survival. It was about something far heavier: how love can be twisted into leverage, how trust can become a weapon, and how even the purest sacrifice can be answered with betrayal. Robert lived. He walks with a scar that tells two stories at once, one of a father who gave everything, and one of a son who nearly took it all away. That scar is his survival, but also his burden. Michael, meanwhile, sits behind concrete walls, his future traded for $500,000 he never touched. He will serve his time, but no sentence can undo the truth. He destroyed the one bond in life that should have been unbreakable, and that is what chills us most about this story, because betrayal from strangers is expected. Betrayal from enemies can be endured, but betrayal from your own child, that's the kind that echoes forever, long after the verdict is read and the cameras go away. The Stanton case has become a modern cautionary tale, reminder that greed can rot even the deepest roots of family. It teaches us that sometimes the darkest dangers don't come from outside our homes, but from the people we would die to protect. Robert once said, "I gave him life twice." What he never imagined was that the second gift would nearly cost him his own. And that's the haunting truth we're left with. Sometimes the greatest threat isn't a stranger in the shadows, but the person sitting across the dinner table. If you found this story gripping, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Murder Book 360. We bring you more stories of betrayal, crime, and the chilling truths that hide behind closed doors. Stay tuned for the next part.